Beneficent, the Merciful, may his peace and blessings be upon our Prophet Muhammad and his purified progeny. Welcome to the Convertsation. Respected viewers, brothers and sisters in faith in the Walayat of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, thank you for joining us today for another episode. I am Daniel PEYSER, and with me is, as always, my co-host, Sheikh Yahya Seymour. And on today's episode of The Convertsation, which is a program in which we discuss the daily challenges and struggles of converts to the religion of Islam, we'll be beginning what will inshallah be a short series of episodes dealing with the subject of the holy month of Ramadan, which is now upon us. The time of Ramadan is one that for the whole Muslim community is one filled with blessings, in which, of course, the gates of God's mercy are open, and inshallah the gates of hell are shut, in which the shaitan is chained, and in which we also have to face other challenges such as our own nafs. It can be a challenging time as well as a time of great opportunity, and we're going to discuss the convert experience during Ramadan, both for new Muslims and those who might be experiencing their first Shahr Ramadan, or some who may have been in the community longer, and so on and so forth. So opening it up from that perspective, what might we say are the first issues that come to mind when we're approaching the subject of Ramadan in terms of the convert experience?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على محمد الأمين وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Dear respected viewers, as the topic was crucially introduced by my co-host Shaikh Daniel, we need to understand that when we talk about the holy month of Ramadan, there are numerous issues which need to be taken into account. Numerous issues, be they according to spiritual well-being, psychological well-being, things which we need to discuss on behalf of both the convert and the community, and the dynamic that plays between the two. And we need to be quite open about these issues in order that we yield a spiritual growth expected by Allah Azza wa Jal when He instructed us to make this month a very special one. For after all, there is numerous khususiyat, numerous specific special qualities which are held within the month of Ramadan. For example, it is the month in which we are commanded to observe an obligatory fast. Now, some people have a very reductionist view as to what an obligatory fast entails. Is a fast merely abstaining from the carnal pleasures of the world, such as marital relations, or eating, or drinking, or even things such as smoking for those of us who happen to smoke? Absolutely not. Ramadan entails the fast, which has specific qualities, namely, it is both a physical abstention from something, as well as an abstention of the soul. For example, there are certain things which the ulama have ruled as forbidden during the month of Ramadan. We need to be more careful in our akhlaq. We need to be more careful in the way we deal with people. Brothers who live in the West and unfortunately live in areas of fitna, in which we live in an era of immodesty, especially those who live in the modern capital cities of the Western world, need to be observant as to where their eyes are looking. That is not to say that outside of a month of Ramadan they're given a freeway or a license to do so, but we are saying that because in the month of Ramadan we are aware, as Shaikh Daniel said, the shayateen from amongst the jinn are captured and basically enchained and prevented from harassing us and causing us to have these devious satanic thoughts. Unfortunately, we wish that the shayateen from amongst mankind themselves would also be chained down, but through observing the fast we can inshallah ta'ala chain down the shayateen, which we ourselves often become in being immoral and indecent human beings. Given that, and given that the month of Ramadan is the blessed month in which Allah Azza wa Jal has decreed that the night of power is within. The night of power, of course, being where we can change, inshallah ta'ala, our destinies as they were written And also, it is the month in which the blessed first Imam of the Shia, the wali of all the Muslims in the world, the wali of all the true believers, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Amir al-Mu'mineen wa Imam al-Muttaqeen, was martyred by the accursed shaitan from amongst the mankind, namely Ibn Muljam. May God's curse and wrath be upon him, and may Allah fill his grave with fire and condemnation. We find, therefore, that given this month is such a special month, again, the Holy Quran was revealed in its entirety upon the heart of the Holy Prophet within the month of Ramadan. It is a very special month. It's a month which needs to be dedicated entirely to Allah Azza wa Jal. We wish to speak about the practical steps in order to make the best of this month, to extract the spiritual fruits of this month, and to make ourselves decent human beings.
Do you find that there is very good introduction, by the way, to say that was actually one of the nicest encapsulations of Shahr Ramadan that I've heard in a long time. I remember early on when I converted that there was a lot of pressure all the time, especially in like the evening lecture series that you listen to for Shia in lieu of the Tarawih innovation, that there's a lot of emphasis on extracting the most out of the month of Ramadan, about spiritual development, about not being the same person at the end of it as you were when you went in, or that this is some kind of deficiency perhaps, or a sign that your fasting is perhaps not as well accepted if there's not some kind of progress or self-reformation during that time, if there's not some sort of spiritual journey that you go through during that. Now, on the one hand, that's a really appealing challenge, I think, for some converts. At the same time, it can also, for new Muslims, be somewhat overwhelming because they're still struggling to get the sort of basics of fasting down. In fact, I don't know if you can remember your first fast, but I can remember mine because it was not that long, I think. It may have still been after conversion when I found out that there was a big difference between the way that Muslims fast and the way that you have fasting, for instance, in Catholicism or some other religions.
Absolutely.
And being caught off guard with the fact that I couldn't have, for instance, water during the day. And my immediate thought was, this is not actually possible. No one can actually do this right, especially while attending classes or working or doing other things like this. So just trying to master this, or some of the other exigencies that I'm sure we'll get into that come with the month, how does that relate, I guess, to this process of spiritual self-development? Or is sometimes the emphasis that's put on how far we should expect ourselves to sort of push our limits during the month, can that make it a little too overwhelming for some people early on? I mean, how do we take it slowly in a way that's going to work for everyone, for new Muslims especially, I guess?
Well, I believe that the best way to introduce Shahr Ramadan to the new converts, and indeed anyone who begins practicing for the first time in their life, be they from a born Muslim family or not, is to introduce them to the spiritual dimension of Shahr Ramadan. Too many a time we find that the Muslim apologetical system, which is commonly known as da'wah, and of course da'wah here normally stems from a very shallow, simplistic, street ghetto kind of Salafi apologetic, which unfortunately, because it's become the mainstream explanation given to non-Muslims, has trickled down into the Shia community, because people quickly do a Google browse and find some explanation from a Salafi. Some of these explanations are extremely weak, extremely shallow.
You have explanations about like
why we fast, absolutely. So for example, it has been proven that the human body becomes so much healthier from the fast. Sure, it's amazing that we know that today scientifically, because we can now extract that as being one of the benefits of Shahr Ramadan. But as we know, according to philosophers of science such as Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, science is constantly going through phases and revolutions. It's constantly changing its worldview. So my question to such apologists is, if tomorrow it's proven that according to contemporary science and scientific majority view, that fasting is actually something detrimental to the human body.
Yeah.
Or are we now going to go, oh, you know, well, and just give up fasting? Forgo it? Absolutely not. We would say that Allah Azza wa Jal has a divine hikmah behind commanding us to fast. We may not know that divine hikmah. We may not know exactly why we have been commanded to fast. We know that Allah Azza wa Jal says in the Quran, it is so that we might have taqwa. And yet at the same time, is that the reason for fasting? No, absolutely not. We would not say that if someone who fasts does not end up having taqwa as a result of fasting, then the obligation of fasting is now lifted from him because of this. No, we would say that Allah Azza wa Jal has commanded the fast, and He's commanded it for numerous reasons. So the first thing we need to do is ensure that the new convert, the new believer, be he someone born into a Muslim family or not, has a complete awareness of his relationship and obligation with Allah Azza wa Jal. Is he fasting because Allah Azza wa Jal has commanded him to? Certainly yes, we would submit that this is the main reason why we fast. But what are the spiritual benefits from fasting? What are the aims and objectives of this month? Is it purely to lose weight, as some people claim it is? Is it purely to have a degree of affinity with people in the world who are unable to eat at normal times of the day? And I believe this is a very beautiful understanding of fasting, but it's merely one understanding of fasting, one dimension of the fast, and we should not reduce the entire fast to being all about having an affinity or understanding of those who are unable to eat during most times of the day.
Especially because those people who are unable to have access to sort of food security or water or other things like
will
that.
Not be breaking their fasts after Maghrib.
They don't have, it's Ramadan all year for them in that sense. Yeah. But I certainly wouldn't view it as necessarily some journey of spiritual self-growth in that context.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I think obviously it can be an important window into that.
Sure.
In terms of the experiences either that you've heard about or that you've had yourself, sure, what would you say are some of like the more challenging things, or what can you remember in particular from your early experiences fasting as being the more difficult aspects of, well, not just say fasting, but the month itself? What kind of challenges did it present? I can say briefly for myself, one thing that's still an issue maybe is if I am home with my parents. Maybe this year it will not be quite the same, but in years past, even my mother or father will absentmindedly offer me some food, or they'll say, oh, come on, like it's really hot out, like I'm sure you can have like a little drink this one that's not really going to hurt, or whatever else, or not understand the rules of traveling, for instance, around that.
Sure.
So, I don't know, what are some of the challenges that new Muslims might face early on with this?
Well, I've heard about numerous challenges that must be faced. Now we can divide them into one's confined to the non-Muslim environment and another one confined to the community environment. Allow me to begin with non-Muslim environments, and I'll begin with my own personal experiences, inshallah ta'ala. I remember when I first began fasting, as I've mentioned in a previous show, it was about 2 weeks after I met my first Muslims in my city who were advising me. So at the age of 15, going on 16, I began my first fast for the first month of Ramadan that I observed. I remember it being particularly difficult in the sense that I was living at home with my mother, and since she was not fasting, I had to essentially rely on fasting for the first time myself and ensuring I was doing everything correctly. Now, there's numerous things which you gradually learn as a convert, namely, when you first convert, sometimes you're unfamiliar with how, depending on the duration of the fast. I remember my first fast, alhamdulillah, was in the month of, was in a winter month, because it was roughly 10 years ago now.
So that's maybe a lucky start for you then.
It was a luckier start for me, alhamdulillah, in the sense that the days, or the duration of the day, was not nearly as long as it is during the summer. However, because I was in a period of my life where I was still in high school, I was preparing for my, what we call in UK, A-level exams. No, actually, yes, I was preparing for my AS level exams. In such a period of your life, you need to be able to have a high level of concentration. Unfortunately, because I was relying on preparing breakfast for myself, also preparing dinner for myself, I remember that the nutrition I was getting from these meals was not necessarily the highest.
Yeah.
And so my concentration span was going extremely low. And I was particularly worried during that month as to whether or not I'd be able to continue. But alhamdulillah, I managed to look online for advice on what kind of food to prepare. And through experience, I was able to kind of deduce how much I should be eating at breakfast time in order to sustain myself, what I should be eating, and more importantly, how much you should be eating in the evening. Unfortunately, a massive problem that we have is normally, well, when I first converted, I was part of the community of the Sunnah, who follow a different reading of Islam naturally, and we used to have a very hearty iftar. What I mean by very hearty is a very fully heavy packed iftar, which is going to make you want to sleep immediately after having it, and which doesn't help when you're praying Isha after breaking your fast. More importantly, because you're engaging in I'm gonna drop a bit of a maybe I should keep this to myself, but I call it the Sunni yoga practice, namely the Taraweeh prayers.
Okay.
You're going to need something heavy like that in order to continue. But of course, we believe that Taraweeh is a bid'ah, an innovation, which was implemented into Islam. Even the person who implemented it as a group practice believes it was a bid'ah.
Bid'ah hasana.
And so, unless they want to argue that he was crazy, we'll take his testimony for it. And there's no need to debate that any further. But we'll do a further show on Taraweeh and why converts should not be tempted to partake in it, because I have met Shia converts who, through their ignorance and willingness to be more spiritual, have said things like, well, I know it's an innovation, but, could we not just...
Or it's for the sake of unity.
Exactly. There is no unity in innovation, deviation, or disbelief.
Well, there might be in the next life, certainly, when they end up in the same place. But I guess what I was going to say...
Allah is the best of judges.
Yeah, of course. What I was thinking, just before we cut to break in a minute, is the hardest times for me were when you have like the dinners like what you're talking about, and then if I had to, for instance, work the next morning, but then because I'd be either up late going to lectures or other things like that, I would then oversleep Fajr for some reason. Sure. So you get up and you have to fast, and hopefully you ate enough the night before.
To sustain yourself till the evening.
Yeah. And that was always kind of like my worst nightmare, and maybe it still is for a lot of non-converts as well. But just the sense of, if you've missed that, your day, especially if you're a professional, is already going to be kind of difficult, especially early on in the month. And later on, the flow kind of changes a little bit, but even then,
Sure.
times of difficulty change. Maybe they become later in the day or other things as you adjust to it. But anyway, inshallah, we're going to go to break now. Thank you for joining us in the conversation. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can email us at the information posted on screen. We'll be back in a moment. Please stay tuned. Thank you for joining us again on The Convertsation. As we left off for the break, we were discussing the issue of fasting for the new Muslim and some of our early initial experiences with this, or challenges, difficulties, that kind of thing. One of the things, Shaikh, that you started to touch on, or we did anyway, was the subject of fasting in other faith traditions as well. What would you like to add about that?
I wouldn't really like to add anything, but maybe it's crucial that I add to it, just so the audience understand what we were referring to, namely in terms of a difference of understanding, or a divergent understanding between different faiths in regards to what fasting is. And again, this is something that's very crucial for the Muslim to understand, because sometimes Muslims can get carried away. They hear that another tradition has fasting, and they'll just invoke it as a similarity, even though in reality the only commonality is the term fasting. Naturally, I think we can both appreciate being from Catholic traditions previously, namely the Roman Catholic tradition, although I'm sure that it remains the same within the Eastern Orthodox Church traditions of the world. Within the religion of Christianity, there is a concept of fasting. Normally, it takes place in the period of Lent. I used to observe it when I was much younger and still had a faith in God before going to high school, where that was stripped from me for some time prior to finding Islam. Alhamdulillah. In my younger days, when I chose to observe a fast, I remember I asked my teacher at primary school, Catholic primary school, what is the best thing to kind of give up for a fast? And she said that it could be anything. You just sacrifice something for the sake of God. And as we've both commented on during the break between ourselves, we find that this fast is very much what we would define according to Islamic terms to be a batani fast. Yeah. It's more of a meaningful fast as opposed to an actual physical fast. What do I mean by that? I mean, I was suggested by my teacher to give up red meat. She said that in Greece sometimes they do this, or to give chicken. Or
yeah, chocolate and red meat are often the things that I hear.
Absolutely. So I announced to my family I was going to give up red meat during these days of fasting. No one else in my family was taking up a fast during those days. And what I gradually began to find was every second or third day they'd be serving red meat at dinner. And I'd be like, oh, whoopsie, kind of forgot about that one just for today.
Wait, were they actually serving more red meat than usual, or you just noticed it more? Or
no, well, in my family they were eating red meat probably once every 3 days. Largely Filipino households, Scottish household, but my mom was Filipino. So,
yeah. In terms of dietary, it's
exactly. And so I went to my Catholic chaplain at school to complain about this, and he's like, it doesn't matter, the intention is there, and so you're kind of thinking, well, I haven't had to sacrifice much here really, other than an intention, and so through that intention, that's the kind of fast we observe, and so it's very, very different from abstaining from food, drink, and everything during the entire day.
Even if we have some fasts, and I feel like I remember maybe must be some on the Catholic calendar where at least food is out of the picture.
Sure.
But even then, there's still, you can drink water, juice, Gatorade, whatever, sure, that kind of thing. Which, early on, when you first start fasting, usually by like the 5th or 6th hour, you would kill someone for a cup of Gatorade or something. At least that was my experience in the first year.
More of a Powerade man myself.
Whichever, man. I'm not even sure I can tell the difference. But
Powerade tastes less salty.
Well, thank you for enlightening me. On that note,
that's our job on this show. Shaikh Daniel, helping the convert community is our job.
So, okay, then in this case, this one of Shaikh Yahya here is which one? Powerade. In my case, I go with classic lemon lime Gatorade for my fast breaking, which I usually get at the Woolworths across the street from my center. But yeah, it's certainly something we find in other faith traditions. I'd be lying if I said I knew a great deal about it in Judaism, though, so I can't really comment too much there. Perhaps there's more traditional fasting.
Sure. Another kind of misconception I experienced amongst converts is there was a gentleman who came to convert in our community in Scotland, and the misunderstanding he had was he had understood from the term fasting, he had created a mental connection or mental imagery associated with Buddhist monks. So he believed that fasting literally meant you didn't break that fast
for the whole month,
for the duration of 30 days. And he was like, how do you people survive?
Not the first person with that misconception.
No, of course not. And I believe that's purely due to the Muslim community not engaging the outside world and explaining to them what their obligations are during this holy month. And sometimes I've actually found that if you just explain these things to your employer, or sometimes the teachers in your school, or again lecturers in your university, depending on where you're at in life, they would have a degree of understanding which may explain away some of your behavior, namely a lack of concentration or an inability to show up to a tutorial due to being completely knackered. Or for example, if you're at work and say for example you work in the service industry, say in a shop or something similar, they may understand that, look, having such a person deal with stock and unload boxes is maybe not the best thing to have him do towards the last few hours of the day during his fast.
Sure. I actually hear this about medical professionals all the time.
Sure.
In fact, it's usually an argument I hear against fasting,
Okay.
which is proposed or put forward generally by Islamophobes.
Sure.
Which is, you know, there's a lot of Muslim doctors. Do you want to go to a Muslim surgeon if he's fasting or something like this?
Sure.
I mean, again, this comes back to the issue of why we fast.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be, I think, kind of difficult to describe the spiritual benefits of that to someone who is looking at it from the outside.
Yeah.
Certainly, the type of fasting that we do in Ramadan is not something that non-Muslims could not try or practice as well. I mean,
Quite the opposite. I've known non-Muslims who have tried it out, and as I told that non-Muslim, if you try it, you'll like it.
if you try it for the whole month without breaking it once, maybe you'll have some other problems.
I believe that non-Muslim ended up converting, so alhamdulillah. What I don't tell you is the fact that he found that the community was extremely judgmental and ended up leaving the faith, but you know, Allah guides who He wills, and the community misguides whoever they will. Well, now, but
Unfortunately, that seems to be the case sometimes. In fact, I can tell you, I remember one of my friends who, I don't know that he was necessarily close to converting anytime soon, but is now actually a seminary student as well, just in Christian seminary.
sure.
Would come to functions periodically at the center in New York I would go to, and once I invited him for iftar in the evening, and just to give people an idea sometimes of what kinds of things can go wrong, even doing tabligh with someone who I had brought to the center several times before, that during the salat, of course, he's not going to pray with us, right? So I just said, you know, here's a chair, please make yourself comfortable, you can sit in the, just behind us, wherever. And right after the iqama, I hear some commotion in the back, and I'm thinking, oh, please don't let this be what I think is about to happen. And basically, someone had made a big deal out of the fact that he was sitting there and not praying, and that he had his backpack with him, and of course, so he must either be someone who's there to spy or has a bomb in his backpack and wants to kill all of us. And so got in this big shouting match saying he wanted to look inside my friend's bag and this other stuff. And at that point, my friend was like trying to excuse himself basically and
From the premises?
yeah, and leave. And I excused myself as well because that was incredibly
Rude.
it was
Discourteous
just
as well.
breathtakingly offensive for
Sure.
something like that to occur. Now, if this had been
So much for Muslim spirituality here too. I mean, what kind of fast are you engaging in? You're
Precisely.
going to treat people in such a way.
Precisely, right? So he got kind of the bum's rush ultimately, and after that, to their credit, the sheikhs from that center sort of like, one of them handled this other guy, while the other came outside with me and tried to get my friend to come back.
Sure.
Which, as I recall, he eventually did. But
Alhamdulillah.
it was tense, you know, and it was shocking to me in terms of if this is how we look at non-Muslims, or how we look at even someone who may be a prospective Muslim, or who's just interested in learning more about the faith.
Sure.
That I don't think this would be a common experience, thank God, in a lot of communities.
Absolutely.
However, you know, even in New York, maybe it's a somewhat special city in the case that we have a much more active surveillance program run by our
Sure.
police department than
Which is unfortunate.
even
Which is
the FBI and NSA run on the Muslim population in the Middle East.
It's
So,
unfortunate, but when those who act in the name of Islam follow the actions of their predecessors who, under the name of Islam, terrorized the world at large and
destroyed entire
and
cities.
the family of the Prophet at large. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon them all. Then it's not surprising that a city like New York has to act with a degree of paranoia. But what you'd expect is a degree of understanding that within the Shi'i community, we don't have these trends of terrorism and bloodshed because it's not within our prophetic paradigm. It's not within our model of Islamic history.
Absolutely. On the other hand, that it's still something that we are viewed with suspicion with anyway.
Sure.
So, especially during Ramadan, actually, that's when you do get apparently more heightened surveillance. It's also a time when we get more heightened police protection sometimes because we tend to get more acts of vandalism or that kind of thing, which is, I actually would like to go out of my way to point out, in my own experience, I think happens probably, from what I've seen in the news, less in the States than in Europe. However, it's still a prevalent thing.
Well, unfortunately, if you keep up to date with the news in Europe,
especially
in
France.
the UK as well. I mean, we just had the elections for European Parliament because we're members of both the EU as well as a nation state in our own right. One of the far right parties, which has always maintained an appearance of being a far right party, has gained a substantial amount of seats and has kind of thrown out the Conservative Party as the dominant party, which does raise concerns for future elections. But we're not here to discuss politics. And just to give you a reflection of how European Islamophobia is growing.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that. It's something in the U.S. that we have to deal with. I guess it's probably another episode's discussion. But I think I will say I think people's perspectives is frequently that it's worse in the U.S. than anywhere else, at least in people from the Muslim world. But when you actually go there, I think when I read articles about some of the things that happen, particularly some of the hate crimes that happen in Europe, I cannot even begin to imagine some of those same things happening in the U.S. Now, they have a couple of times, but not with the same degree of frequency or...
I don't want to take up the show's entire time by asking these questions, but is there any reasons why you can perceive that being? I mean, in US, do the Muslim community have a tendency to adopt the more conservative aspects of the faith like they do in Europe? For example, how's the hijab of women? Is there a woman who wear niqab over there?
Sure. Not, I wouldn't say a lot.
Sure.
And I think this would probably vary from community to community.
I see.
But at least in my experience, even in areas in the U.S. that people tend to consider to be more backwards or provincial, let's say.
Sure.
That even in those areas, people can still be very welcoming and non-judgmental. Now, you always have some crazies, but they usually sort of keep that contained a little bit. And for the most part, what you see when there's kind of attacks on community centers or things, that the people who do this are sort of, maybe they might have some provocation in terms of by politicians or other things.
Sure.
That it tends to be people who are mentally disturbed in some way, and who've just sort of gotten hold
buy
of
into
it.
Conspiracy theories, that kind of thing.
Maybe, yeah. And in some cases, just have some kind of personal issue with someone at that center, maybe, or other things like that. Anyway, so it's something that can also increase during Ramadan, unfortunately, in some areas as well. And,
I must say, I'm rather disappointed to say this, but may Allah bless this nation, for it is the nation in which numerous of the Imams are, namely, we have 6 Imams in the nation.
If you count the one that went missing here, yeah.
Absolutely, sure. 5 Imams. I've encountered the
and relatives of the Imams and prophets and
absolutely a very blessed land. but particularly we're in the holy city of Karbala where Imam Hussein alayhi salam was slaughtered. It's unfortunate that out with the hospitable time of Arba'in, in which people were on their best behavior, serving with zuwar, so on and so forth, I've encountered comments, particularly about yourself, myself, other brothers who are here from the West, and even brothers who are here from Pakistan, from the population here, which if we had heard from your average Joe Blogs layperson in the West, white person, we would have condemned him for severe cultural ignorance as well as racial prejudice. Yet over here we can sometimes hear it from, with great unfortune, students of knowledge, people who are studying within the seminary and are khatibs in this country. And so sometimes I do think it's a relative thing. I think, alhamdulillah, because the West, particularly where you're, the United States is built upon a tapestry, a sort of melting pot of history, it contributes to the fact that it's a bit more racially tolerant.
Yeah. I think, like I said, it's a bigger discussion. But I guess in terms of my own friend's experience that I mentioned before, I had to do a lot of makeup work after that, I felt like, to make sure that that wasn't the takeaway image he had during, especially during Ramadan.
Did you find him willing to return to that center at all afterwards? Because I imagine he returned to the center purely because he felt under pressure to accept the courtesy of your Imam who came out and maybe insisted that he come back in.
I think that that's largely true. You've got to keep in mind, too, that the guy who accosted him, my friend is a very slight person, and the person who accosted him was a very large person, actually, and it was very physically intimidating, I think. So, but it was made clear that, you know, there would be no more problems that evening. So after that, I don't honestly remember if he came back. I think even I was wary after that about inviting anyone to community events that some of the people who would do this kind of thing might be at.
Understandable as well.
And if I can tell you the most disturbing part in all of this to me is that the person who did this was, to the best of my knowledge, a convert themselves.
I see. Well, that's a very important aspect to introduce to the discussion here, because
yeah,
we're lifting the stereotype from the born Muslim, indigenous Muslim population who sometimes treat converts in such a way. But from what I've understood from you, it was again a racial issue. Is that not correct?
It might have been partially that, and it may have also been partially some mental health things or other stuff. It's kind of hard for me to say. However, I'm not. Let me just check and see how much time do we have left? 2 minutes. Okay. Since we don't have that much time left, maybe we'll have to bring up that part of the angle later.
So
but what I would say is that it, I think, comes from emulating the sunnah of someone other than the Prophet.
Sure.
And I think probably this is like the prison convert mentality, and not the positive one anyway, that came out there more than anything
Very
else.
unfortunate. So if we have a very short duration left, I don't want to waste the rest of our time by engaging in further upsetting talk. Rather, we'll try and highlight the main context of why we raised these issues. Dear brothers and sisters, converts, non-converts alike, we have raised these issues today on this episode of Conversation, which is going to be the first of our Ramadan specials, in order to highlight certain issues which need to be highlighted. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to speak about it today, but we are mainly concerned with discussing how both the convert and the non-convert can benefit each other, and particularly yield the greatest fruit from this holy month of Shahr Ramadan, a month in which our relationship with Allah Azza wa Jal should be increased, a month in which our relationship with the Imam of our time, may Allah hasten his reappearance, who we know fasts alongside us during this blessed month and shares with us the responsibility of this obligation from Allah Azza wa Jal, is also worshipping alongside us during these blessed nights. We wish to increase our relationship with Him, and more importantly, we wish to increase our relationship with the Book of Allah Azza wa Jal. Unfortunately, we were unable to touch upon many of these subjects, yet we were able to discuss what we might believe is a basic introduction to the topic of Shahr Ramadan. Inshallah ta'ala, within the next few Ramadan specials, we will be elaborating more on these issues, and especially more on the issue of what we as a community, namely both converts and non-converts alike, can do to benefit one another in order to further our growth as Muslims and perpetuate the spirit of Islam which Allah Azza wa Jal wishes for us in this blessed month. Jazakumullah khair, Shaikh Daniel.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode of The Convertsation. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can email us at the contact information posted on screen. Likewise, we hope that you'll continue to join us for the upcoming episodes in which we'll continue to discuss the issue of new Muslims and converts and the convert experience during the holy month of Ramadan. May God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet and his family. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.